I'm joined by Colorado's Democratic Senator Michael Bennet during the second day night of the convention. Thanks for making the time for this.
I'm glad to be with you. Thanks, Marshall.
So I consider myself a political reporter who does politics for people who don't eat, sleep, and drink politics, kind of like a sports fan.
I consider myself a politician for people who don't eat, sleep, and drink politics.
Well, then you'll be
the perfect, explain something.
You'll be the perfect person to answer this. If I'm a sports fan, I generally don't tune in if I already know what the result's going to be, probably. So if I don't eat, drink, and sleep politics, why am I caring a lick about a national convention when I know the outcome is Joe Biden is going to be the nominee for president?
Well, it's an opportunity for people to hear a message from the Democratic Party, in this case, a party that's out of power in the sense that we don't have a majority in the Senate and we're not in the White House. And I'll bet there are a lot of Americans out there who are really worried about the turmoil this country is going through right now. And they want to see whether there's an alternative in the Democratic Party, as I believe there is. So they're getting really their first taste of that for this fall election during the course of this, somewhat weird convention, admittedly, because we're not all there. It's all virtual.
In what feels like a lifetime ago, you did an interview in June 2019 on PBS while you were running for president, where you were asked, does Joe Biden represent the future? Do you remember what your answer was?
I don't, but I'm sure you'll tell me what it was.
No, I don't think so. I think it's time for a new generation of leadership. Yeah. So why do you support someone who is not a new generation of leadership?
Let me come to that, Marshall. I think that the Democratic voters through this process reached a conclusion, which was they believed Joe Biden was the best option for beating Donald Trump. And they coalesced around him extremely quickly after the early contests in South Carolina and thereafter. And I actually can't argue with that judgment. I think that's a rational and reasonable judgment. I did want to have a new generation of leadership. I think it's time for us to do that. But I also believe it's incredibly important for us to beat Donald Trump. And I think this ticket of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris is a ticket that can do that convincingly.
Today, the stock market hit a record high. And while there are a lot of people suffering from COVID-related unemployment, a lot of those people or average people invest in the stock market or have 401ks. Is it bad for Democrats that the stock market is doing well during a pandemic?
I don't think it's bad, but I think it's largely irrelevant to the lives most Coloradans and most Americans are leading. We have seen an unbelievable disconnect during this COVID crisis between the stock market, which is essentially where it was when COVID started, and the fact that we've got millions of Americans that are unemployed, millions of Americans that have lost insurance, hundreds of thousands of small businesses that have closed that will never open again, kids that are scared to go to school, moms and dads that are scared to send them to school. It doesn't surprise me that disconnect exists, because for 50 years we've had an economy that's worked well for the people at the very top, the top 10%, and hasn't worked for anybody else. And throughout that time, the stock market has done just fine. I don't think the stock market is the best way of measuring our economic health. I think the best way of measuring our economic health is whether everybody's wages are rising or not. And for the last 50 years in this country, that's seldom been the case.
Follow my logic here. I've been seeing a lot of protests nationwide, covered it a lot in Colorado, and those protests led to change. Specifically in Colorado, the change was a police accountability law that changes how law enforcement behave and how they're held accountable. You're in a Republican-controlled Senate that is currently not in Washington, D.C., that hasn't solved the continuing weekly unemployment money for people unemployed, especially related to COVID. What is your version of a protest? Why don't I see Democratic senators doing a sit-in and refusing to leave Washington? Like, what's your version of a protest?
Yeah, my version of a protest is to make sure Mitch McConnell is no longer the majority leader in the Senate. Because as long as he's the majority leader, we're not going to get anything done for this country. He has no interest in infrastructure. He has no interest in police reform. He has no interest in doing anything on climate. He has no interest in doing anything on guns. The only stuff that he cares about, and it's well documented, Marshall, as you know, are putting right-wing judges on the courts. I think we've put enough of those on the courts, and cutting taxes for rich people every now and then. I think it's time for us to do something else, and that something else leads through beating Mitch McConnell. He's never going to put a police reform bill on the floor, but I'll tell you this, Marshall, it gives me huge hope in the state of our democracy that not only did Colorado respond to those protests, but it responded in a bipartisan way. Do you know, it is remarkable that that police accountability bill passed the state Senate in Colorado with every Democratic vote, and I believe all but 2 Republican votes. That is seismic. And what that means is we can take the example of Colorado to Washington and say, look, in a purple state, we're listening to the people in the streets who are demanding long overdue change, and we need to respond to it now as a nation. And there's no excuse, because Colorado did it in a bipartisan way, not in a partisan way.
I don't have the numbers. I believe there were a few more Republican no votes, but I don't have it in front of me.
Well, you might be right, but this vast majority of Republican state senators voted for it.
I know that was an awkward question. It was more about, like, if without additional unemployment money, isn't there an answer besides going home? What's the answer besides Democrats going home to their home districts and letting it?
I think we should be there today. If it were up to me, I'd be there. I'm in Del Norte, Colorado today. I was in Center, Colorado earlier today. I was in Salida last night, and I'm visiting people that are suffering through COVID and trying to deal with, making sure that the potato markets are open and other things like that. And that's important work, useful work, but I believe we should be in DC. And maybe, after this shameful behavior with respect to the post office, the Republicans in the Senate, led by Mitch McConnell, will conclude that we ought to go back. But unfortunately, the people in the minority don't set the agenda, which is why, it's really important that 82 days from now, or whatever that period of time is, roughly 82 days, we give Mitch McConnell his walking papers. He's shown that he's not interested in legislating on behalf of the American people.
Under my work from home desk, I've got a printer here. It does not print money. It seems Washington, D.C. likes to print money. So with the unemployment benefits, if they come back, at some point, what are these decisions going to mean for me 10 years from now or 20 years?
Well, let me tell you something, Marshall. We are at an epic downturn in this country. We're at an epic economic downturn. We are at an epic healthcare downturn. We have a president who failed the most basic test of what it means to be one nation under God, which is a nation that can actually react to a pandemic by supplying tests, by supplying contact tracing to people, by having PPE available for the frontline responders in our healthcare system. And he's just made matters worse. And in these moments of profound economic dislocation, there is the need to invest in our economy so matters don't get worse. We saw that happen in 09-10 during the last recession, and Mitch McConnell refused to help. We saw it happen again this time, and fortunately, we had a unanimous vote that allowed us to pass it. There are certain times when you've got to ride to the rescue when the American economy has cratered. What I object to is that somebody like Mitch McConnell, who has voted for more deficit spending than any American in the history of our planet, $17 trillion, much of it to borrow money from the Chinese to give the richest people in America tax cuts, tax somebody like me for deficit spending. I'm doing it when the country needs it, when we're at the depths of a recession potentially turning into a depression. He's passing income tax cuts for the richest people when the economy is rising. It's absolutely ridiculous. So yes, 10 years from now or 15 years from now or at some point, we are going to have to figure out how to put our fiscal house in order, how to come together as Democrats and Republicans in a responsible way. I've said over and over again, I don't think there's anything progressive about leaving a whole bunch of debt to the next generation of Americans. And unfortunately, because we've made a lot of bad choices over the last 20 years, we're facing them. that. But I don't think that obviates the need for acting when working people have been thrown out of work and small businesses all across this country have been destroyed.
I appreciate you remembering the question and coming back to it at the end there. I do like that. A couple more things.
I think if you review my answer to your question, you'll see that actually it was a fairly fulsome answer to your question.
Just a couple
not
more.
An answer to another question.
Do you agree with the executive order power of Governor Jared Polis and what he's been doing under the executive order power?
I haven't studied it, so I guess I can't answer that in as general a way as you've asked the question.
So I ask because I'm curious what the power that the president tried through the executive order. What makes that, from a Democratic view, it seemed Democrats were against that, while locally in this state, Democrats seem all for what the governor is doing under the executive order power?
Well, as I say, I haven't studied what the governor's been doing under his executive orders, so I can't speak to that, although I do think he's been doing a very good job managing this state through an incredibly difficult crisis that has been made only worse by the utter lack of leadership by Donald Trump. I think, broadly speaking, what I'd say about President Trump is there's no president in the history that I'm aware of, and I was alive when Richard Nixon was a president, who has more violently been uninterested in the rule of law or the separation of powers or the constitutional limitations on his office. And it has been shameful to see him, for example, reprogram money away from our military bases in Colorado so that he can build the wall that Mexico was supposed to pay for, that he couldn't even get Republican majorities in the Senate or the House to pass. So I think, my guess would be Jared Polis has done nothing nearly as egregious as that. And I'd be willing to bet that no politician, no Republican or Democratic president has ever done anything as egregious as Donald Trump in that regard.
You were part of a news conference yesterday on the Postal Service and mail-in ballots. And today we're hearing that the Postmaster General is delaying changes to the service until after the election. I just wonder, is jumping on that topic, because we're going to cover it as media and we're going to fact check it, but is jumping on it and giving it so much attention like a cat following a shiny object, it's almost like, it feels like it's a distraction. And
it doesn't feel like a distraction to thousands of Coloradans who live in rural communities who are relying on the Postal Service to get their medicine. It doesn't feel like a distraction to Colorado's veterans, the majority of whom get their medicine from the U.S. Postal Service. It doesn't feel like a distraction to the communities all over Colorado that rely on the post office to operate small businesses. So actually, I think it's the opposite of a distraction. What's horrifying is that the President of the United States would seek to disable the post office to try to get himself reelected. That's terrifying. It's the kind of behavior that you expect from a Turkish dictator or from Vladimir Putin, not from the President of the United States.
I will wrap with this. You think it's important for people who aren't that involved in politics to watch this convention, dabble in it a little bit. Do you make the same?
Sure, I think it's important. Look, I think it's useful to collect as much information as you can, and there'll be opportunity to see people speak, including our vice presidential nominee and our nominee for president. I think that's of use to people. What I would say is most important is that every single one of us who's eligible to register to vote registers to vote, and that every single one of us who is registered to vote actually casts the vote. I'm proud I live in the state of Colorado, where Republicans and Democrats came together a long time ago to make sure we had a system of mail ballots that makes sense when you're not in a pandemic, but is absolutely essential when you are in one. We are leading all 50 states. And what I would hope for Colorado is that we go from having the second highest voter turnout in America, which is where we are today, to beating my friend Amy Klobuchar's state of Minnesota and having the #1 turnout. So I'd say everybody get to the polls and vote.
So I just want, with that passion, I'm going to guess that you're not going to be glued to the TV next week, but should people who watch it and dabble in it this week give it equal attention during the Republican National Convention next week?
I say watch both of them. Watch both of them. And, you know, the last time there was a Republican convention, as I recall, there were a whole bunch of people that went out and trashed the nominee of their party. It'll be interesting to see what they do this time. You're not going to see that in the Democratic convention. In fact, what you saw last night was Republicans at the Democratic convention saying that we ought to vote for the Democrat. Marshall, I'm not the most partisan person you know, and I know you know that's true. But let me tell you something. This guy does not deserve another term as president. McConnell doesn't deserve another minute as majority leader. And we have the opportunity to make these changes that are going to be so critical for our kids, for our grandkids, and for America's place in the world. I'm really optimistic about where we're headed after we've been through this incredibly difficult and trying time.
Thanks for finding good Wi-Fi in Del Norte.
Thanks. Come to Del Norte.
Thanks for the time.
Thanks, Marshall. Good to see you.
Yeah.
Bye.
And Marshall, I checked on those numbers. The Senate, only 1 voted against the police accountability bill, and 13 voted against.
No, I think it was 1 the first time through, and I think it was 2 the second time.
Oh, you were just talking about the Senate, not because I know the Republicans.
That's what I said. That's what I said.
Okay.
I said the Senate. I said the Senate.
Okay.
Thank you. Peace.
Thanks. See ya.
Thanks.